Hello and welcome to the Turn 4 podcast. I am your host, Dan Maldonado. I am joined by my co host, Tim Reiner. Hey, Timmy, welcome back.
Hello, Dan. Thank you. I know I
It's
was out
good.
last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was.
Yeah, it's good to see you. We have a special guest with us today. We are joined by Nathan Brown of the Indianapolis Star. Welcome to Turn 4, Nathan. Thank you for
Well,
joining us.
thank you guys for having me on. It's great to be here.
For sure. It is great to see you. You know, we do see you on occasion when Tim and I are at the races. And I know I bumped into you at Road America. I was there as a fan this year. I wasn't there with, press credentials or anything like that. So it's always good to see you, but it's great to see you here because a little more laid back. It keeps us talking about IndyCar and things happening there. And of course you have your finger on that pulse much more than we do. We're just fans with a microphone. So, we get to actually sit down and talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about for once. So, but hey, before we get into a lot of this, I just want to take a minute. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, how did this all happen for you?
Yeah, I know it's amazing. I've been doing this job for what now a little bit over 4 years. Feels like it's flown by, but I grew up just north of Indianapolis in Noblesville. Went to high school in Noblesville. Went to somewhere around maybe not quite a dozen, but close to a dozen Indy 500s growing up. My dad's been going since the mid 80s. So just growing up around Indianapolis IMS, the Indy 500, always was something I was loosely paying attention to, had some familiarity with, certainly with everything that goes on with the month of May. Would always go to the 500 practice qualifying ever since I was 6 or 7 years old or so. And so got into journalism, graduated from IU in 2014. I've started off with a couple full-time jobs, one at a paper in Southern California covering high school sports, moved to the greater New York City area with my now wife. When she got a job out there, was doing some freelancing. I ended up moving to New Orleans, where we did long distance, because she still had a great job there. I had, spent a year kind of applying for everything I could. Didn't find anything great out in the New York City area, so decided to take a chance, moved to New Orleans, covered everything from the Saints to the Pelicans, high school sports, just about everything you could imagine there. And after about 6 or 7 months of that, wife and I were trying to find a job for her in New Orleans or a job for me to move back to New York City. Eventually started just trying to find jobs that we both wanted to apply to in same city. And Indianapolis was one of those, with me having a lot of family here. One of those cities that we looked at, there was an open job, first off at the Star on the Colts beat, that I applied for. Did not get that job. Ended up going to Jim Aiello, who had been covering IndyCar for the Star for nearly 3 years at that point. So that IndyCar job opened up. Still piqued my interest, still intrigued me with a little bit of 500 background, though hadn't been paying maybe quite as much attention. I think the last 500 I had gone to, if I remember right, was 2013 or 2014. So it had been a little bit for me at that point, 4 or 5 years. But applied for it, got it. My wife also got a job here at the Star, where she worked up until this January. And so we moved to Indianapolis, and I've been here, hit the ground running with, I think my first or second day on the job was aero screen testing at IMS in October of 2019. And 5 weeks later, Roger Penske bought the series and bought IMS, and it's been full throttle pretty much ever since then. But it's been a great 4 years on this beat. Have really enjoyed it, and have really enjoyed getting ingrained in everything motorsports and everything IndyCar and everything around this city.
Yeah, so you had an understanding of IndyCar and the what it means to the region and everything else there. So it kind of brings you back there. That seat technically that you occupy, is that the Robin Miller seat?
Yeah, so it's I mean, obviously, as you guys know, the Indianapolis Star has a really long history of covering motorsports. That was, I think, became probably most prominent when Robin was here at the paper for a couple of decades. I think, I mean, back then not only was the paper staff so much larger, but sports section was as well. So we had, Robin covered it for a long time. I don't entirely know how things flowed. Like I think Kurt and Robin covered a lot of motorsports for quite a while. Kurt being Kurt Cavan, who took over the beat almost fully in the early 2000s. Worked another 15 years. A great reporter here, great mentor of mine as well. Before he moved to IndyCar and IMS, and still works there in the PR department. And then Jim Aiello, who was working on the sports desk as I think like a general assignments reporter or producer, took over, and he covered the 2017, 2018, and 2019 seasons before I took over in the fall of 2019. So it's Kurt and Robin had the reins for probably 4 or 5 decades there, and Jim and I have kind of traded off here in quick succession. Jim is now with The Athletic. But I certainly have enjoyed doing this, and don't plan on moving anytime soon.
If you take a look at the guys that were sitting in that chair prior to you, I think longevity is sort of comes with a gig. Hopefully, right? That's what it seems like, at least. How does it happen where you develop these sources or these resources within the paddock? They're not handing you a notebook saying, "Here, call these guys for this." How does that happen for you?
Yeah, so I mean, when I took over this job, what I spent the first several weeks doing was just going to every single shop here in the Indianapolis area. You reach out to the main PR contact there, get a chance to go and take a tour of the shop, meet with a couple people. So it starts there, just kind of introducing yourself to people that you get a chance to meet there. But in terms of building sources, I think a big part of it is, first of all, just being present at as many races as possible, so that folks just continue to see, whether it's drivers or engineers or team managers or team owners or PR officials, folks just continue to see your face, get a chance to talk to you again and again, week in and week out. Even if you're, not necessarily working with them on a story, even just getting 30 seconds to chat with someone here or there, start to get a chance to build a relationship that could start with, "Hey, I met you at the shop once," and then you say hi the next couple times, and then maybe you strike up a conversation, and then maybe you're maybe in those conversations you come up with a great story idea, and so then maybe you're talking to this person for a story, and things just can kind of snowball from there. We sometimes get a chance to doing interviews with certain team members, get a chance to talk to a guy on the phone, and so maybe you strike up a relationship that way. There are some drivers that, if you have a good enough relationship, will just say, "Hey, if you need anything, text me, here's my number." Certainly am not on that level of familiarity with everyone in the paddock, but I think if you're present, and if you do good, honest work, and you do right on everything, the news features, the good news, the bad news, show up, and are willing to talk through things that people might be frustrated with, I think you can start to hopefully build just a reputation of someone who cares a lot about what they do, who isn't here to necessarily be a cheerleader, but is here to cover the sport. And I think the sport is really in need of not only folks that care about it, but folks that are willing to take the time to dive into everything it is, from small driver signings to the big picture stories, and tell the truth of what's going on, because in the end, that's what matters most.
Yeah, it's about exposure, right? We
Mhm.
talked a lot about that when we started this podcast. I mean, Tim and I, it was just kind of an idea that we pulled together. I think Tim didn't think I was that serious about it when it did
Not
come
at all.
together. But it's about exposure for the series, right? It's a series that we love. It's a series that we're passionate about. It's a series that we believe in. So it's really just about exposure. Look, I've been brutally honest about some teams. I've been, very complimentary and very overly like I make some excuses for some folks out there because I'm a fan. It's what I do, but at the end of the day, it's still about exposure. I mean, we do get good engagement, people talking about it, and I think that's really where that go. You have good engagement. When you take a look at some of the things that you tweet out there, where you're. I mean, some things out there just need to be said a certain way, and I think some people they get like aghast by it, right? And it's like, no, this is what's going on, right? You can't just always candy coat everything. It just doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of, I mean, how do you see the strength and the health of the series today?
Yeah. Big picture question, could probably talk on for a couple hours if I really thought about it enough. But I think generally speaking, it's in a good spot. I think you have an owner in Roger Penske and Penske Entertainment who really care about the sport, who have long, deep ties to the sport in IndyCar and IMS. And I think that's the most important thing. You might have, maybe, I don't know all of the ins and outs of the negotiations that were going on before Tony George spoke up or struck up a conversation with Roger Penske in September of 2019 and got the ball rolling on the sale. But, let's say the series could have been sold for more money to some sort of an investment firm,
Liberty Media,
exactly,
say, for example.
for example, I don't know someone that has no tie to the sport that is desperately trying to grow and take advantage of incremental gains and media and exposure and fan growth and financial growth. I don't know if someone like that would necessarily have the patience to make sure that something like this succeeds, maybe and sometimes in the short term to their detriment. I mean, this series is in need of a big boost to really get to the level of other motorsports properties like NASCAR and Formula One. And this is not even me saying that I necessarily think that they're going to get there here in the short term, but they need a big boost to get to a similar level of those two in popularity, in notoriety, just in the mainstream sports landscape here in the US. But I do think Roger and Bud Denker and folks that had been around even before the sale, in Mark Miles, Doug Bowles, Jay Fry, I do think this group, though they have their flaws and some of them are easy to talk about and noted, or blind spots maybe is even a better way to call it. I do think these folks really care, and that's the first jumping off point. This is going to take this 5-10 year plan of trying to grow this series is going to take a lot of money, and it's going to take a lot of investment. And Roger has shown some interest in diving into his pocket to improve the everything, every inch of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And we've seen a little bit of that here lately with IndyCar in terms of a decently expanded marketing budget for the 2023 season, and I think we'll continue to see some of that similarly, or maybe even a little bit more in the coming years. But it's going to take more than that. So I think it'll be interesting to see what and how much changes over these next couple of years, just from a popularity standpoint. But I think we're on the right path. We're certainly not trending downward. But you don't want to. It's hard to watch a sport like Formula One, even though it's I think for a lot of fans that have been around the sport for more than a couple of years, feel like it's been tough to watch lately when you don't feel like there's almost any drama and who's going to ultimately win those races. It still has the attention of a lot of folks in this country, and NASCAR is the same way. And it's going to take a lot to get to that level, but I hope that for the sake of the sport, I hope that they're able to chip away at that a little bit in these next couple of years. But it's really hard to figure out, because it's not just one thing. Hard to figure out exactly what's going to get it there.
What do you think? I mean, just comes to mind, your gut tell you, what's the danger spots? Like, where does danger lie for IndyCar?
Yeah, I think the something that I mean I've read about a little bit in NASCAR lately, and I know it's um something even for a sport that is, a racing sport that's that big, that has a lot of attention. I know series officials have at least mentioned it or touched on it, about just having um drivers that don't capture the attention of your casual fan or your mainstream fan. The folks that have been around this sport or have a deep love for this sport and have for a while, are going to continue to follow it, whether your Will Powers and Scott Dixons and Tony Kanans and Elio Castroneves are here or not. They're going to, as their favorite drivers retire, um, they're going to continue to stick around and find reasons to tune in and watch, whether it's to, find a new driver that they love or just tune in because they love this sport and they've been watching it for so long, and it doesn't make too much of a difference to them that their favorite driver isn't necessarily around. But a lot of the big names that we've known around the sport for a long time are starting to phase out. We don't know how much longer Dixon will be here. Elio Castroneves has stepped away from full-time IndyCar racing. Tony Kanaan has raced his last race. We don't know necessarily if Ryan Hunter-Reay is going to be back for another 500. I have a pretty good feeling that he will be, but he's the type of guy that you don't know how much longer they'll be here. Simon Pagenaud, to a lesser extent, maybe wasn't quite as popular as some of those guys, but I know has a strong, passionate group of folks that really enjoy coming out to the racetrack and cheering for him. Don't know what his future holds. Will Power is not getting any younger. So there's a group of guys that have been around this sport for 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes even more, that are in similar ways to NASCAR, when the likes of Tony Stewart and Jeff Gordon and Jimmy Johnson and now Kevin Harvick, when you have folks like that are now stepping away from the sport, I feel like NASCAR is in a place where they're in some ways struggling to find ways to market their drivers and get folks to fall in love with them and come to racetracks and buy merchandise and tune into races simply because they love that driver. I do think IndyCar is in a place where, over these next couple of years, I really hope they find a way to get fans to connect with some of these younger drivers or this next crop of drivers. We know that guys like Pato O'Ward has done it on his own. He doesn't need the series necessarily to help him do that. He has an incredible knack, and he and the folks around him in his camp have an incredible knack for social media and for marketing and for putting some money down to buy a suite or two and get folks to buy merchandise that comes with the ability to spend a weekend in a suite, like he did for Texas. Things like that get him to the level of just being swarmed at just about every single racetrack that we go to, no matter if it's in Portland or Central California or Texas or Florida, or Indianapolis, of course. But there's a short list of guys that have that that garner that level or even close to that level of interest in the sport. And I think that's something, again, that it is not easy, and there's not any one thing that you can do, barring having a docu-series type show on Netflix that Formula One, I think, really used to create some of those heroes and villains like Gunther Steiner and Zach Brown and Daniel Ricciardo and Toto Wolff and Christian Horner and Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton. It's tough to do that in small ways, just through, say, social media or through podcasts or through YouTube shows or through features in this magazine or that newspaper. It's a lot longer, tougher road to do. And so I'm interested to see how the series goes about doing that, because I think that's a really important thing for the sport. When I've been asked that question before by some folks, I think to other sports that are really big in this country, and you have folks like myself who will tune into an NFL game, say, for example, I'm a Miami Dolphins fan, and so I'm going to tune in to watch the Miami Dolphins, whether they are 2-14 or 12-4, and completely irrelevant or vying for a divisional playoff spot. So you have those folks in motorsports, but there are a lot more folks, especially younger folks today, that are interested in singular athletes. I think more so than teams, whether it's the NFL or the NBA. I think the NBA probably even more. And so I think the key to growing the sport and finding that younger audience is trying to get them in love with the people of the sport, because when it comes down to entertainment, which the sport is, that we sometimes kind of forget, I think it comes down to the people and the storylines around them. I know IndyCar really loves to talk about how competitive the sport is and how great the on-track product is, but I think that only goes so far when you're trying to build a sport, as we've seen in Formula One, and in its audience growth that we've seen in the US in the last 3-4 years. Folks that hadn't watched a Formula One race before and are now aren't tuning in because the races are so exciting. They're tuning in because they have people and they have storylines that they want to watch. And so I think in some way IndyCar needs to recognize that, and they do. I'm confident, but recognizing is one thing, but figuring out a way to solve that problem is something completely different.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned obviously the series, recognizing drivers and being able to promote them, but I think a lot of it goes on some of the teams too. And there's a team that comes to mind that I think does the best of the series to promote their drivers. And I think it's up to the sponsors to use some of those drivers within their advertising to really drive it home to people that are casual watchers or those that don't watch at all. Do you feel that there's a team that goes above and beyond others and that other teams should kind of follow that mold in order to promote their drivers and really have a younger fan base? I know there's one team in particular that I believe that brings a younger audience. There's merchandises everywhere, and maybe it's their association with maybe F1, but I think there's teams that can learn from what others have done in the series. And I'm just wondering your take. Do you see that day in and day out when you're talking to them and what they're doing to promote their drivers?
100%. I think we all know that you're referencing Air McLaren there, and they do a phenomenal job. And a lot of that, I really do think, comes from the way that they go about marketing their two drivers in Formula One. McLaren's one of the most popular teams. There was a survey. I know IndyCar had its own survey, and I think they came out as the most popular team. And if McLaren wasn't the most popular team also in Formula One, maybe they were the most popular among the younger demographic in a recent motorsport survey. They do an incredible job on both sides, and that certainly, as that strategic relationship that turned into actual ownership of the team with McLaren and Aero Schmidt-Peterson over the last couple of years has really come to fruition. You've certainly seen that, where not only on the track but off the track, that team has really adapted to how McLaren goes about doing things, and one of those things is just having a really smart, savvy, in touch social media plan. And we see that in IndyCar with the creative ideas, the creative videos and activities that they do with their drivers that don't really have anything to do with racing. It just gives you a sense of who they are as people. I also think in some way it's a bit of a team building exercise. I mean, there's a lot of team building that you can do in the engineering room, or in going to dinner, or just spending time around the shop together and focusing on how to make the car better or the team better for the upcoming season and the off season. But I have to imagine that those teams, certainly with the relationship that we saw in Pato O'Ward and Felix Rosenqvist before Felix left the team at the end of this last season, I think a lot of that not only came from who they were as people, but the work that they did and the time that they spent together behind the scenes. And I think ultimately, when you have a good relationship with your drivers off the track, I think that can only foster a better working relationship on the track, and ultimately that feeds into, I think, in lots of ways, the relationship and the atmosphere that folks who aren't the drivers have within that team. I know we've seen a lot of coming and going from that Air McLaren team the last couple of years, even the last couple months. And some of that is, I think, probably due to the passion that the team and its leadership has in, they have an idea of what it means to be someone that works for that team, and you either fit that mold or you don't. And for some folks, it's invigorating and it's fun and it's exciting, but some folks don't necessarily fit that. So I think there's certainly some of that we've seen from that team, but it doesn't mean that team is perfect by any means. But we've seen, at least I feel like I have, some of that rub off on some other teams. Like I think the most that I've noticed, at least, is Andretti Autosport, one of those teams that I think, if I remember a couple years ago, just didn't have super interesting social media presence. I find myself nowadays, if they're putting out a video that involves last year, for example, Colton or Devlin or Romain goofing with each other, Kyle Kirkwood obviously included in that as well. Those became things that you wanted to watch because they were funny and they were refreshing and they were lighthearted. And frankly, it was interesting to see, after a season where that team had been kind of quietly, until it was not so quietly and very public, at Mid-Ohio, kind of at each other's throats and behind the scenes. And to see that turn around, though I'm sure things are not necessarily rosy and perfect all the time this past season, it has been fun to get to see and get to know some of those drivers just kind of out of their shell. The interactions that I get with most drivers are in bullpen sessions or in small 15-20 second conversations on pit lane. Very occasionally you'll get an extended interview on the phone, sometimes in person on a race weekend. And then there are a couple drivers that you feel comfortable enough texting with, whether it's just kind of getting their take on something that's going on in the sport, or using as a source for some things that they are directly tied to, or maybe not. But seeing those ways that some teams have taken to social media, I do agree. I think that's definitely a key of this problem of trying to build those drivers' personas and their fan bases, and how we can be known, or how we can know and be drawn to them. But social media at the same time is it's not the only answer. I know my boss, for example, talks about how we feel like Twitter is such a big thing for folks that are on it all the time, especially for someone like me who uses it primarily to send around stories and reporting that I do. But it's a lot smaller group of people that are really on it than you really often think about. And so it can't be the only place that you do that. It can't be the only tool that you use. And so I think it's a great first step, but really maybe just a first step in that process in lots of ways.
Yeah, so I think the line is everybody has a part in this, right? The series has got a part, the teams have a part, drivers have a part. So everybody's just got to come together and sort of see what's working and what's not working, and then apply it towards what is, and hopefully grow the series by spotlighting the drivers.
Definitely.
I think part of what makes McLaren's social media work so well is the dynamics amongst the drivers, right? Because you had prior, with Felix there, even now, right, with Malukas there, you have three very, very distinct personalities, and it's just that whole dynamic works. Definitely. I don't know what makes them so popular. I mean, Tim has single-handedly funded that third car just from buying merchandise. But
for my kids.
yeah. But I know I actually have a McLaren jersey, right? I have Felix's, but I don't know what makes that so popular. Like to me, I don't, and maybe it is a little drives to survive kind of bleed over or something there. Cause I don't see what I shouldn't say that. I'm surprised at how big a presence that team is when you look in the crowd and you see all that orange and you see all, everything going on there. I mean, it's great, but it's still puzzling to me.
I think there's something to um, just that McLaren brand in racing. So if you're someone that maybe very casually was following IndyCar, in the 2019, 2020, 2021 timeframe when McLaren really began to sink its teeth into that team and take over. If say you're a Formula One fan that kind of casually knew IndyCar for a long time, um, maybe now that you say you've been a McLaren fan for a long time, if you feel like you all of a sudden have an extension of that McLaren team that's over here, maybe now all of a sudden you really like IndyCar and you're in tune and you want to go to races because that's in essence a McLaren team in IndyCar and you've loved that McLaren team in Formula One for a long time. I think there's something to just, as we've said, the way that they've gone about promoting themselves, taking chances and risks on stuff, putting their drivers both inside their comfort zones and out of them as well, and you get a chance to know them as people. They've also, of course, used folks like Tony Kanaan that are big fan favorites now. We'll have Kyle Larson and Papaya here in next spring in the Indy 500. So they've taken big swings at things, and there's I think something to that. But yeah, it's hard to figure out in some ways because they haven't had as much success as I think they would have liked, and as much success as you would think it would take to have such a rapid rise in this series in terms of popularity and growth. But I think some of it goes to just their passion and the work behind the scenes, and that in their social media and their media plans at large. And then there's probably something to the fact that they have drivers in Pato and Rossi and Tony Kanaan that even in their own right are fairly popular, and they've given those guys a chance to thrive and a platform with McLaren that's already fairly big.
Yeah, and I wonder if like the kickoff to that is bringing Fernando Alonso over. I wonder if that was like the impetus to really like kick it off, and then they've just drove behind that ever since, and they've come up with great branding and great marketing ever since they brought him to the 500. So maybe there's a sort of a jump off point, and that's the jump off point that sort of catapulted them to where they are.
Definitely something to that. I mean, it would be interesting if that had a really major impact because I wasn't as close to the sport back in 2017 when he made his first start here, but I know a lot of that entry was fairly Andretti heavy, and then he came here and didn't make the race at all in 2019, and the story was kind of their failure. So I'm sure there's something to that in them getting kind of a soft launch those couple of years, and just folks that either were aware of them because they're massive Formula One fans, and so they kind of started paying loose attention or became aware of IndyCar, and that only grew more when they took over Eric Schmidt Peterson or something else. It's definitely possible. I'm sure there's something to that. I don't know how big of an impact that did have, but there's probably something to say to that.
You mentioned Kyle Larson a minute ago. Who really benefits by bringing Kyle Larson to the 500? Does IndyCar benefit more by that, or does NASCAR benefit more by that?
I think it's a new car by a long run. I'm not as keyed into NASCAR, certainly anywhere close to as much as I am in IndyCar, but I'll be very interested to see how much you hear from or see NASCAR pushing the narrative of him doing the double and how cool that is. I'm sure you'll see some of it. I imagine a lot of it coming, say, from like NASCAR's main social media account, but I don't know in NASCAR circles if it's going to be anywhere close to as big of a thing. Because I mean, the way I think about it, if you're in the NASCAR world, he's not doing anything more over there. He's not doing a race so that he can do the 500. He's doing everything he does in NASCAR and then going and doing another event. I know this is by no means is this probably a very good comparison, but it's kind of the only thing I can think about. You know, folks over there know that Kyle Larson races in just about everything he can get his hands on. And so in a way, I almost kind of wonder if you're a massive NASCAR fan, don't really have a whole lot of um, time spent following or focusing on IndyCar. If maybe, let's say, fans over there might think of this as an even bigger version, whatever the biggest sprint or dirt car race in the world, if folks over there see that as an exaggerated version of doing this, he's hopping into something else that's totally different from what he drives for his day job, and it's cool and it's special, but I don't know that folks that don't have some sort of a connection will really dive into how cool it is, as much as folks who are firmly planted in the IndyCar world will. It's an opportunity for the sport to have one of the the greatest active racing drivers in any discipline try out this race that's the greatest race in the world for lots of reasons. And I think it's very cool to see that. We don't, frankly, at this point in the sport, we just don't get to see that crossover often. You mentioned Fernando Alonso. It's a great example of that. Certainly a much lesser extent when Kurt Busch did it back nearly a decade ago. Certainly was a pretty big NASCAR name at that time, but I don't know, certainly not as decorated or as maybe much of a household name, or just didn't have the relevance in the motorsports world in terms of being known as a guy who not only does it all, but does it all really well and wins races and championships and lots of different things. So I think of this as kind of taking us back to that era of, I mean, really, in some ways, that that time frame between the 60s and the 2000s, between that early portion of that where you had guys like AJ Foyt and Mario Andretti, and folks that primarily raced in Formula One that would kind of go back and forth. You'd have guys that ran in IndyCar and Formula One and NASCAR all in the same year, and then to a lesser extent when you had a handful of those guys that tried the double in the early 2000s, most prominently Tony Stewart, a guy that got his start in IndyCar and then eventually transferred over to a career in NASCAR. This is something that's really unique, and the unique side of it is the part that's happening on the IndyCar side. And so I think that's why, if you're someone someone who's planted in the NASCAR world versus someone who's planted in the IndyCar world, I think IndyCar will have a lot more to say about it, to write about it, to talk about it, to podcast about it, to opine about it. And ultimately, when it comes down to May 26th, I think it'll be a lot bigger deal at the racetrack in Speedway, Indiana, than it will be in Charlotte. So I'm sure will be a big thing after he finishes the race, and probably even while it's going on. I imagine they'll maybe have some way to broadcast it there at the track, or you'll at least have lots of people that will be paying attention and seeing how he's doing. And then the story will be, can he get to Charlotte in time? I think the way this always works is, that driver misses the driver's meeting and, gets there within 20-30 minutes of the race starting in a helicopter. And so he has to start last. And so there's always the tension and the curiosity of, is he going to make it there in time? Unless there's some weird circumstances. I imagine he probably will. Although I think it was Tony Kanaan that revealed when Larson was here doing his rookie orientation program nearly a month ago that, say we have some sort of a rain delay in May, there at least have been some conversations that Tony would potentially be the driver to hop in the car, if there was an extensive rain delay and Rick Hendrick had to make the decision on whether he would send Kyle. to Charlotte and actually leave the 500 and tap in and need a substitution driver, Tony would be that guy. So there'll be something around that. Certainly, if we have some weather that's coming in around that week, but I do see that as a lot bigger IndyCar storyline when it comes down to it all.
Do you think he can win it? Just curious.
I think in the right circumstances, yes. I mean, this is a different example. But I mean, we've had rookies that have won this before, and a lot of them have been a lot less talented, or a lot less decorated. Granted, say like Alexander Rossi, for example, had a super duper long history in open wheel cars, but not oval racing in an open wheel car, and even the open wheel cars he did race in the junior Formula circuit, and ultimately he's couple races that he did race in Formula One, and the testing and simulator work that he did for a couple of years there was still different than an IndyCar when it came down to it. But we've seen guys that do that in the right circumstances. Is he going to win, straight out in a normal race scenario if we have some generally pretty normal green flag running the last back half of the race? Is he going to outduel the likes of Alex Palou, Scott Dixon, Alexander Rossi, Pato O'Ward, Marcus Ericsson, Joseph Newgarden, and Will Power, Scott McLaughlin, Colton Herta? Probably not. I don't see that, as just because the field is so darn deep. I mean, I don't know how many names I just rattled up, but it was at least 10 of guys that, regardless of where they qualify, and there's even more guys that I didn't mention, but regardless of where they qualify, that they're going to be in the hunt if they don't crash, or if they don't have a terrible pit stop. And even if that gobbles up a couple of those guys, you still know that you have a half dozen guys that are just so experienced and either have won this race or should have won this race or are likely going to win this race at some point in their careers. So I think it will be tough to do in that type of scenario before he gets one under his belt. But with that being said, I feel fairly confident that he will be in the mix. And then if there's something where, whether there's a crash that takes out a good handful of those guys, or if there's a gamble that they can take on strategy or fuel saving, in a way like Alexander Rossi did in his first race in 2016 with Andretti Autosport, with Brian Herta on his radio, I think there's certainly a chance that we could see something like that. I don't think it's a great chance, but I think there's always an opportunity for something like that to happen. And then if he does that, I will be very interested to see how post race looks, because I think there will still be a need to get him to Charlotte, and so I don't think he will probably have the opportunity to celebrate and kind of bask in this win like we've seen other guys do, because I think ultimately he will still need to get over there, and that will then kind of transition into the story of how unique a 500 is, and maybe the fact that we don't get to he don't get to celebrate it quite as much or as normally as other guys have in the last 100 years or so.
So the 500 next year will be the first oval race of the season with Texas not on the schedule. Is Texas a hiatus, or is Texas gone?
I don't have a great feel for it. I know that IndyCar officials that I talked to both on and off the record around when that, where there was a risk of that happening, and then when it ultimately did end up happening when the schedule was released, I know there's a lot of confidence there that they can come back, and that this was just a temporary thing that didn't work, in part because of NASCAR wanting to kind of revamp and tweak its schedule, and IndyCar and kind of ended up on the cutting room floor after it already had a lot of crucial pieces really of its schedule kind of fixed in place, where they knew they wanted to have a late summer, early fall race weekend at Milwaukee, and they had they'd already decided when the end of their season was going to be in Nashville, made a big thing of that in early August. So you kind of only had so many windows that you could work with. they went back and forth and trying to figure out, is this something that we can do in the fall? Is there a way we can do it in the spring? And both sides, I think, kind of just ended up in a stalemate where sometimes in these types of situations, you end up with a solution that neither side is entirely happy with, but it's a solution nonetheless. And I just don't think that they were able to quite get there. And so I hope with, 10 to 12 more months to work at it and talk about it. And now just kind of have, I think, a general idea of, first of all, where Texas fits in the NASCAR schedule. I think I feel pretty confident in saying that unless Texas goes through a wholesale change, I don't think that track offers a race that's deserving of being in the playoff calendar. And so I think it's likely to stay in that spring slot for a while. So then if you're IndyCar and you can plan around that, and that's some place that you want to be back, maybe you can find a way to get that to fit into your fall schedule in other ways, and maybe switch something else around. So I'm hoping that that's the case. I know that they think that that's a big and important market to be in. We already don't have anyone, any races that we go to on the East Coast. That's kind of that one race in that corner of the country until you get all the way out west to California. So I think that Dallas-Fort Worth area is important, although we certainly haven't seen it too much in folks that actually pay and go out to that race. But sometimes in that springtime frame, they have a lot going on in that area too. So hopefully they can figure out a way to do it. Maybe the solution is having a race there before football gets going. That's an August night race situation, kind of like they have with Iowa. Hopefully there's room to do something like that, but something like that might end up being the only way that folks at Texas are willing to make it happen. And ultimately it's up to them. IndyCar can want to go to a track as much as they can, but as we've seen it with ovals falling off the calendar over the last decade to 15 years, you can be there as much as you want. But if a racetrack doesn't want you back, and they don't think that you make financial sense for them to host a race weekend, because ultimately it comes down to dollars and cents, and it's not just a goodwill or a good storyline thing, that you have to be able to make ends meet.
Yeah, I think you got to get the fans there for sure. The optics are really bad from a TV perspective, but Dan has his theories on why IndyCar needs to be in that market, and he's discussed that several times on our podcast
I think
on who's there and why it makes sense.
It's fourth largest TV market, number one. Number two, NTT, AT&T, Toyota, right? I mean, there's a lot of major brands that are in that market that, make it want to work. Pato O'Ward's fan base, heavy Hispanic fan base in DFW. You got to make this thing work one way or another. So that kind of leads me to, if you can't get that level of promotion and you can't get to where you think you need to be with Texas, could this potentially be, and I know I'm asking you to just speculate, but could this potentially be one of those Iowa models where IndyCar is heavy influenced with promotion and taking over the race, similar to, I think, what they're going to do in Milwaukee, similar to what they do in Detroit, really take it over and try to make it work, versus depending so much on, the TMS folks?
It's tough to say. I think part of why that was originally able to work, say at Iowa, for example, these last couple years, where IndyCar essentially, as I understand it, basically leases the track for a weekend, and I think was allowed to kind of, I imagine at their own expense, granted, kind of do what they wanted with the property for a couple of years in terms of improving it, polishing it, giving everything a new coat of paint, and bringing it to Penske level standards. Even though it was owned by NASCAR, I think it was a fairly dormant facility otherwise. And so I think that played a lot into the fact that IndyCar kind of got free reign and was allowed to do what they wanted. And Milwaukee isn't owned by, a NASCAR or an SMI. And so I think that's another place where because you don't have big players in the picture like that. It's a place that needs visibility. That is, they're now back hosting truck races on the calendar, so they're a little bit further down the road than Iowa was for the most part, back in the the around the pandemic, or 2021, or what was it? It was 2022 when that race came back on the schedule after it was not on it in 2021. So I think there's part of the reason there why that's a place that's willing to work with IndyCar. Detroit's always been basically been an event that Roger Penske has owned and helped run for a long time. So you've got the history there. I don't know as much, though IndyCar loves to talk about it and speculate about whether that could be an option, in terms of a big teamwork heavy type event that IndyCar could kind of wrap its arms around and take under its wings. I think ultimately it comes down to money, and you have to, I think, be in a place where there's a vision to seeing this making a profit at some point down the road. Iowa, I imagine, probably didn't make a profit in its first year, maybe didn't in its second. But when you're making that business model, you have to be confident that when you're spending millions upon millions upon millions of dollars to get worldwide famous musical talent, that you can have enough people there that are interested in coming to the racetrack, and B, have enough people who are interested in coming to the racetrack and paying a high dollar ticket. And so I think it's a lot tougher when you've been struggling to get 4,000 or 5,000 fans there for a long time. And it's also a market kind of unlike Iowa, where there's a lot going on. You got an MLB team, you got a football team, you got college sports. And so it's maybe a little bit tougher to have that be an area where folks feel like IndyCar there is quenching a thirst of theirs. And so they feel like, that's something that they're willing to pay a lot of money to do. That Iowa market also is an area where you have so much short track racing going on just about every single weekend until, once it's warm enough, until mid to late fall. And that's not maybe something that's quite as true in that Dallas area. It's certainly a sports heavy area, but I don't know, outside of your like diehard NASCAR fans and to a smaller extent the folks that have been coming to IndyCar races there for a couple of decades, if that's a market that just has as deep of ties to racing in general. And so I think that's maybe a tougher thing to get. It's certainly something that they could try, but it's also one of those things that you really have to buy in for 3 or 4 years to doing. And you're gonna kind of take your blows and take your losses in those first couple years, and then you have to just have the faith and the belief that it's going to pay off in the long run. And I certainly don't know that I would be confident to be able to say that something like that can definitely work at Texas. And so in the end, I think IndyCar going back to Texas just comes down to IndyCar presenting some sort of a model that gets Texas to feel like it's worth their while, it's worth their manpower, and it's worth it to them from a financial standpoint, because they want to feel like they can sell enough tickets at a price point and attract enough sponsors that they can be making money on it. And what they're essentially doing, and that is, making money on those tickets and those sponsor sales, making the money back that they have to pay for the sanctioning fee. And IndyCar is not going to, want to accept a smaller sanctioning fee than they think that they are worth in such a big market. And so it's that back and forth where you have to find something that can work for both sides. And again, I think that was kind of a place that they reached in a last minute way here late this summer, where they felt like there wasn't an avenue where both sides could find a way to make that work.
Hey, I want to steal 3 minutes of overtime from you. I need to talk about Romain Grosjean going into Juncos and Callum Ilott now on the market. First of all, this Romain Grosjean going to Juncos, I think, is a big surprise. But even more shocking is what happens to Callum at this point.
Yeah, so I think when it became pretty clear that Romain would not be coming back to Andretti Autosport. When that was made official or when it was just something that you could kind of read the tea leaves or see how things were going on and off the racetrack and kind of just guess yourself, even if it wasn't for certain. The two teams that I would have circled would have been Juncos and Dale Coyne Racing, which is obviously where Romain had raced before. When you kind of looked at teams that had seats that were open, a Ray Hall, a Meyer Shank, Ganassi, McLaren, if you thought about what those teams needed and the makeups of those teams and the personalities there, I really felt like a Juncos or a Dale Coyne situation just was probably one of the two that made the most sense. Will admit I was shocked, as I think a lot of people were, when Canapino resigned there, that we would then in a week's time have Grosjean replacing Callum, because I think a lot of folks felt like, in part because Callum was so confident. He'd been waffling about it when we asked him during the season. I think back to time at like Iowa or IMS or Nashville in that time frame, where we would ask him, hey, what can you tell us about your contract situation? There's a lot of these conversations that are starting to have, folks are starting to sign guys up. Are you or are you not in a place to be a free agent and have these conversations? And at that point in the year, he was saying, well, I mean, I kind of am, but I'm kind of not. I can't obviously tell you what my contract says, but he always had kind of framed it to us as something where there were some ways in which he was in control of his own destiny, in some ways he wasn't. And then finally, I think he was brought in to the press conference. It was either after the single day test at Laguna on Thursday of that race weekend of the finale, or it was Friday after that practice. And someone asked him, what can you tell us about next year? Are you going to be back at Juncos? And he said it very matter-of-factly, yes, I will be back. We all know how the rest of that weekend went. And when Ricardo was asked by me and some other people, he kind of pushed back and said, no, we have the option on him. It goes through the middle of December. Things have not been decided. Both of our drivers do not bring funding. And so it's up to us to go and find the funding to be able to keep them. We like both of our drivers, but we also need to have the money to be able to hold on to them. Otherwise, we're going to have to either go find another driver where we can find a sponsor to support and back them, or find a driver that has that money tied to them themselves. And so when we saw that successfully happen with Canapino, felt like there were some things that were going to need to be ironed out to make things kosher between Callum and the team, Callum and Ricardo, that partnership at large. But I still went back to that quote from Callum that he made on whatever that was, September 8th, and even some text conversations that I'd had with him. And a couple weeks after that, as some more quotes from Ricardo had cycled out, he still seemed like he was confident there was no reason to think that he wouldn't be back there. So that was certainly surprising. Not surprising that Grosjean ended up there, but surprising that it happened the way that it did, and certainly a disappointment, as I wrote and have touched on in a couple pieces on our website. Just a disappointment, that what went on there at all this season a couple of times, and that if things weren't going to work out, that those sides couldn't have come to that decision back in mid-September. You don't want something to happen like that in the heat of the moment of what transpired on and off the track at Laguna in September. But if things were kind of already tenuous, and Juncos felt like maybe they had some confidence in being able to get some funding behind Canapino and an interest in Grosjean, I guess I just would have hoped for Callum that they would have been able to decide to part ways with him, then to give him an opportunity to be firmly on the radar of a team like, let's say, Ed Carpenter Racing, for example, who did sign a guy in Christian Rasmussen, who brings in $100,000 scholarship, but certainly isn't paying for a ton of that program when it comes down to it. We know that Ray Hall needed a good amount of funding for that seat with Pietro Fittipaldi. but I
And
think
he
I
has
probably
funding from somewhere. Do we know where that funding came from?
I
And
don't know
we
if
got you now
it's
5 minutes overtime, so
no,
I
it's all
want to
right.
let you know. All right.
I'll finish this thought off at least. But I guess I would have circled Ed Carpenter Racing, as one of those teams that could have been a potential landing spot if he'd been in the picture a little bit more. I think to potentially a Chip Ganassi Racing as a place where I don't, maybe he's not as highly thought of or sought after as like a Linus Lundqvist that had such an incredible light season, and in some ways has the unknown factor that always factors into these rookies that get picked over guy that's had a couple up and down years in this sport. He certainly doesn't have the money to fund a fifth ride like Kiffin Simpson did, and I think Marcus Armstrong was solid there, and obviously Scott Dixon and Polo would have been back. But so look at to ECR, and then maybe Callum gets a nod over, say, a David Malukas at Air McLaren. I'm not saying that definitely would have happened, but would have been an option if he had been available when that team needed to make a decision. Could have been a place that we could have seen him land. So now, when those seats are gone, I think it is going to be very tough for him to find a spot here. Coyne needs money for both of their rides. The reason that Santino Ferrucci hasn't been re-signed or announced yet at AJ Foyt Racing is because I don't believe either he brings enough money to make that a foregone conclusion, or the team is just needing to find some more money before they can agree to that. So if those are your final 3 full-time rides that are available, and Callum isn't bringing any money, he can be as talented as can be, and I think he is a very strong, young, talented driver in this series, but finds himself at a time where rides that fit his profile from talent standpoint and from a financial standpoint just aren't really there anymore.
Yeah, I hope he lands somewhere. Obviously the social media optics of losing his ride, what he did, it isn't favorable for Juncos Hollinger Racing. So, hopefully it all works out for everybody. I guess we'll have to just wait and see. Nathan Brown, Indianapolis Star. Hey, thanks for joining us. I mean, we could probably do 3 hours easily with you and picking through everything and everything that we feel, but we appreciate the time today. Hope you'll come back and visit us again soon sometime. Loved having you. It's our pleasure to have you here and share a little bit of your knowledge with our listeners, and we'll make sure that we keep in touch. You'll see us out there at the races next year, that's for sure. So.
Look forward to seeing you guys. Thanks for thinking of me and having me on, and certainly would love to come on again here soon. We'll again have a lot more to dive into, and as we talked before we got recording here, still a long 4 months to sit around and look forward to that March 10th date before we can see cars back on track and racing again at St. Pete for the first race of the year in 2024.
You always have an invitation to join us at Turn 4. We appreciate it. Thanks.